It was supposed to be an ordinary morning. Quiet, maybe a little too quiet. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel right. No sound of a toddler stirring in the nursery. No movement from the bedroom. No reply to phone calls, and then no reply to knocking on the door. When Meredith arrived at the two-story suburban home, the scene was surreal. The house sat calmly in a cul-de-sac like all the others. Well-kept, beige siding, trimmed hedges. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no barking dogs, just silence and a sinking feeling in her stomach. She had tried calling her sister Michelle multiple times. No answer. That wasn't like her. Michelle was punctual, reliable, especially now, being a mother to a young child and 5 months pregnant with her second. Something was wrong. Meredith stepped into the house calling out her sister's name. Then she saw her. Michelle was lying on the floor of the master bedroom, partially covered by a comforter that had been hastily tossed over her. Blood soaked the carpet around her head. Her body was still, lifeless. The air in the room was heavy, as if it too had gone cold with shock. Nearby, tiny footprints, marked in dark, dried blood, led across the carpet and into the hallway. They were unmistakable, a child's footprints. Her 2-year-old niece, Cassidy, had been in the house the entire time. Alone, wandering, witness or survivor, no one could yet say. Meredith couldn't process what she was seeing. She stumbled back, dialed 911, her voice shaking as she tried to form words. "My sister, she's not breathing. There's blood, a lot of it. And her daughter, she's here. She's still in the house." Within minutes, Raleigh police arrived and secured the scene. Officers guided a dazed, blood-smeared Cassidy out of the house, careful not to frighten her further. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Her silence was its own kind of trauma. She had seen something, lived through something no child should ever have to. Crime scene technicians began their work. The house showed no signs of a break-in. The doors were locked, windows shut, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, no signs of struggle outside the master bedroom. Everything else appeared undisturbed, too clean, too untouched for a violent crime. In the bedroom, Michelle's body lay in a strange position, half on her side, half face down. There were blunt force injuries to her head, severe, repeated trauma. No defensive wounds, no evidence she'd had a chance to fight back. Whoever had done this had caught her off guard. They hadn't rushed. They hadn't panicked. They had been deliberate. The questions started immediately. Who would want to harm Michelle? Why? What had happened during the night that led to this? Detectives noticed the absence of some common elements in home invasions. Michelle's purse was still there, her jewelry untouched. No drawers rifled through, no electronics missing. The motive didn't appear to be robbery. Then there was Cassidy. Her presence changed everything. A stranger wouldn't have left a child alive, roaming the scene. A random attacker might not have known she was even there. The idea that this was an impersonal act of violence didn't fit. One of the forensic specialists knelt by the trail of bloody footprints, carefully photographing each one. They led from the bedroom, down the hallway, to the landing, and then back again. Evidence of a child wandering in confusion, likely calling for a mother who would never answer. Michelle's phone was found on the nightstand, its screen cracked but still functional. No recent messages or calls. The last outgoing call had been placed the previous evening. In the kitchen, her laptop was open but on sleep mode. Nothing appeared out of place, and yet the room felt off, like something had been moved and hastily returned. A mug in the sink, no coffee brewed, a chair slightly pulled out, not aligned with the others. Minor details, but details that matter. Police called in Michelle's husband, Jason Young. He was out of town, he told them, on a business trip. He'd checked into a hotel the night before, stayed overnight, then driven home early that morning. He was calm, cooperative, shocked even. But it was too soon for answers. The scene needed processing. Autopsy reports needed filing. Forensic evidence had to be analyzed. Still, something about the whole situation gnawed at the detectives on site. A woman, 5 months pregnant, brutally murdered in her own home, her child spared, the house undisturbed. No forced entry, no theft, no struggle. It didn't feel like a random act. It felt calculated. They didn't say it aloud, not yet, but the thought was already forming in the back of their minds. The killer might not have broken into the house. They might have been invited in. Or worse, they might have already had a key. And somewhere in that house, under the hum of police radios and the clicking of forensic cameras, was the beginning of a case that would take years to solve, tear apart a family, and leave behind one of the most haunting questions a crime can ever ask. What do you do when the person you trust most might be the one who silences you forever? Michelle Fisher Young was more than just another victim in a crime scene report. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother, a woman whose life, by all accounts, had been built on stability, success, and the pursuit of happiness. But if the crime scene had revealed one thing, it was this: appearances can be deceiving. Born into a close-knit family, Michelle had always been the dependable one, the one who planned ahead, who took care of those she loved, who made things work even when they weren't ideal. She was ambitious but grounded, intelligent yet kind. A woman whose warmth made her instantly likable, but whose strength made her formidable. She had built a life in North Carolina that many would envy, a good career, a beautiful home, a young daughter she adored, and another child on the way. From the outside, everything looked perfect, but perfection is often an illusion. As investigators began peeling back the layers of Michelle's life, they found that beneath the surface of what seemed like a happy marriage, there were fractures, hairline cracks that, upon closer inspection, had been deepening for years. Those closest to Michelle spoke of a woman who was not as at peace as she appeared to be. Her friends had noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. There were hints of frustration in her voice when she spoke about her husband, Jason. Conversations that once revolved around weekend trips, home renovations, and plans for the future had, in recent months, become filled with concerns about his absence, his distance, his unpredictable temper. Michelle had been the type to see the best in people, to believe in working through problems. But even she had started to wonder if the cracks in her marriage could ever be repaired. She had met Jason Young years earlier when they were both in their early 20s. He was charismatic, confident, the kind of man who could walk into a room and command attention without trying. He had ambition, and in the beginning, he had lavished Michelle with the kind of charm that makes women believe in the fairy tale. But fairy tales don't always last. Over time, things had changed. Jason's career required frequent travel, and his absence was felt more acutely as their daughter Cassidy grew. Michelle had wanted more partnership, more stability, more effort. And yet Jason seemed to be pulling away rather than stepping up. He was distant, distracted, and sometimes, just beneath the surface, there was something else, something colder. Her closest friends had seen glimpses of it. They had noticed the way Michelle's smile faltered when Jason brushed off her concerns, the way she carefully chose her words when discussing him, as if she were trying not to set off something she couldn't control. There had been fights, ones she rarely spoke about in detail, but that left her weary. Then there were the rumors. People talk, especially in close communities, and whispers had made their way back to Michelle. Stories about Jason and other women, late nights, unexplained absences, behavior that didn't align with the picture of a devoted husband. From the moment police arrived at the Young residence and found Michelle's lifeless body, Jason Young became a name that could not be ignored. He was the husband, the father of the unborn child that had died along with Michelle, and the person whose presence or absence during the critical hours of the murder would shape the entire trajectory of the investigation. But Jason wasn't just any suspect. He was a man with an alibi, one that seemed airtight at first glance, one that he made sure everyone knew. Jason had been out of town. That was the fact he repeated multiple times when questioned. He had checked into a Hampton Inn in Virginia, nearly 270 miles away, on the night Michelle was killed. Surveillance footage captured him at the front desk, securing his room. His car was seen in the parking lot. His key card records confirmed his entry. It was all so neat, so perfectly laid out, that it should have been enough to erase suspicion. Except for one thing. Detectives had worked enough homicide cases to know that alibis can be carefully constructed. That distance does not necessarily mean innocence, and that even the most seemingly unshakable defenses have cracks. In Jason's, his had cracks from the very beginning. As investigators combed through security footage from the Hampton Inn, something strange stood out. The camera in the hallway outside Jason's room had been tampered with, turned slightly away from its usual position. It was a detail so minor that most wouldn't have noticed, but for trained investigators, it was the kind of oversight that could unravel everything. Had Jason manipulated the camera to create a window of time where his movements would be untraceable? Hotel staff provided additional information. A housekeeper recalled seeing a towel stuffed under the door to Jason's room. A small, seemingly irrelevant detail, unless one considered the possibility that Jason had left the room during the night and wanted to ensure the light from the hallway didn't shine through the crack under the door. Then there was the mileage. When Jason returned home the following morning, his gas tank told a story that didn't align with his timeline. The vehicle had been driven more miles than should have been necessary for his supposed trip. Investigators began reconstructing the possibilities. If Jason had left the hotel in the middle of the night, driven back to Raleigh, committed the murder, and then returned to the hotel before morning, was it possible? Yes. Not easy, not without risk, but possible. As detectives pushed further, Jason's behavior became more concerning. He was cooperative, but only to a point. He answered questions, but when pressed about specific details, his tone changed. He grew defensive, irritated. He claimed to be in shock, overwhelmed by grief, and perhaps he was. But his grief felt measured, carefully controlled, like a man who knew what emotions were expected of him and performed them accordingly. Michelle's family was watching closely. They had lost their daughter, their sister, and now they were left with her husband, a man whose actions left them unsettled. Jason did not behave like a man whose wife had been brutally murdered in their home while their child wandered helplessly nearby. He did not seem broken by the loss, not in the way they expected. Instead, Jason distanced himself. He withdrew from the family, from the community. He refused to speak to the media, a stark contrast to other grieving spouses who often plead for answers, for justice. He moved as if carrying the weight of something unspoken, something buried. The narrative Jason crafted, the one in which he was a man blindsided by tragedy, was one detectives weren't willing to accept at face value. There were too many questions, too many inconsistencies, and then came the autopsy report. Michelle Young had been struck multiple times in the head with a blunt object. The level of force was extreme, the kind of violence that suggested personal rage rather than random brutality. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of robbery. Michelle's body told a story of overkill, of anger, of something deeply personal. As the investigation stretched on, Jason's alibi, so pristine on the surface, became more of a puzzle. If he truly had nothing to do with his wife's murder, why did so many pieces refuse to fit together? And if he wasn't in that house that night, then why did everything about the crime scene seem to whisper his name? The human mind seeks patterns. Detectives, forensic specialists, and crime scene investigators are trained to notice what most people overlook, to find meaning in silence, in absences, in the things that should be there but aren't. The house where Michelle Young was murdered was full of those silent clues. When crime scene analysts entered the residence, they had expected chaos. Violent crimes, especially those fueled by rage, usually left behind traces of struggle. Overturned furniture, broken objects, defensive wounds. Yet here the scene told a different kind of story. There was no sign of forced entry, no pried open doors, no shattered windows, no obvious ransacking. The house was in order, as if nothing had happened, except for the horror contained within the master bedroom. Michelle's body was found partially covered, a detail that wasn't insignificant. Covering a victim post-mortem often suggests a level of remorse or a personal connection between the killer and the deceased. It wasn't an act of a random home invader. It was something else. Detectives carefully cataloged the position of Michelle's body, the blood spatter pattern, and the surrounding elements. The evidence suggested she had been attacked in her sleep or caught off guard. The injuries indicated overkill, repeated blows, long after the fatal one. This was personal, but there was more. A faint smell of cleaning solution lingered in certain areas, though no obvious signs of scrubbing were present. It was subtle, but it was enough for forensic specialists to take swabs, knowing that traces of white blood could still be detected under the right conditions. A single unidentifiable footprint, small, almost unnoticed, was found on the hardwood floor leading away from the bedroom. Not Cassidy's, too large to be hers, yet too indistinct to make an immediate match. Michelle's nightstand remained undisturbed, her cell phone still resting where she had likely left it before going to bed. But when investigators examined the call log, something stood out. There was no outgoing activity after a certain hour the previous night. No text messages, no calls. It was as if her night had ended abruptly, her last conversations frozen in time. The laptop in the kitchen was another oddity. It had been opened recently, but there were no active browser windows or recent searches. A forensic sweep would later confirm that files had been deleted, whether intentionally or as part of normal use was yet to be determined. Then there were the things that were missing, the absences that spoke louder than words. Michelle's wedding ring was not on her finger. It was found inside a drawer, placed carefully, as if it had been removed voluntarily before going to bed. A small but significant detail. Was this normal for her, or had something changed in her marriage that made her decide to take it off? One of Jason's pairs of sneakers was unaccounted for. According to those who knew him, he had a particular brand and style of running shoe he wore often. A similar tread pattern had been found faintly in the dried blood, but without the shoes themselves, there was no way to confirm the match. Detectives made note of another key observation. Cassidy's room was untouched. If this had been a random attack, why hadn't the killer worried about the child? Why wasn't there any sign of an attempt to harm or silence her? The answer seemed to point in one direction. The killer hadn't seen her as a threat. Investigators turned their attention to Jason's belongings. If he had left the hotel during the night, driven back to Raleigh, committed the crime, and returned to Virginia before morning, he would have had to take precautions. His clothing, his shoes, his car, any of these could hold traces of evidence. A forensic team began meticulously examining Jason's vehicle, focusing on the floor mats, the steering wheel, the fabric of the seats. Even a single microscopic trace of blood, a speck invisible to the naked eye, could dismantle his alibi. One of the most chilling discoveries came not from bloodstains or footprints, but from an item tucked away in a drawer in Michelle's home office. A printed document, an email exchange between Michelle and a legal consultant. She had been gathering information on divorce proceedings. Had Jason known? If he had, how had he reacted? Had there been an argument? A confrontation? Had Michelle said something that made her husband snap? The pieces were starting to align, but they weren't complete yet. The crime scene, while full of clues, had yet to reveal its most damning secrets. The walls of the young residence had seen something no one else had. They had held the final moments of Michelle Young's life, and in the silence of that house, amid the bloodstains and footprints, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. In any homicide investigation, alibis are more than statements. They are puzzles, and when those puzzles don't fit the timeline, investigators know they've found a starting point. From the very beginning, Jason Young insisted he had been away on business the night his wife was murdered, checked into a hotel several hours from Raleigh. The timeline was simple, and the data, at first, seemed to back it up. But simple narratives often unravel under scrutiny. The team working Michelle Young's case had already begun to deconstruct Jason's travel records. He had left Raleigh the afternoon before Michelle's body was found. His destination, a medical conference in Virginia. Credit card activity confirmed a fuel purchase during the drive. Hotel keycard data registered his check-in. A camera at the front desk had captured him entering the building, alone, and collecting his room key. On paper it was tidy, but real life rarely conforms to paper. Investigators expanded their inquiry beyond timestamps and hotel ledgers. They requested additional surveillance footage from the hotel's exterior and interior. It was then that something subtle but suspicious emerged. The camera in the hallway outside Jason's room, which should have captured every coming and going, was pointed slightly off-center. Upon comparison with footage from previous days, it was clear the angle had changed the night Jason checked in. Whether by accident or intent, the shift left a blind spot. a corridor of silence. More disturbing was the gap in activity. Jason's keycard showed no movement between check-in and morning checkout. But hotel staff recalled seeing him in the parking lot around dawn, loading his vehicle. This detail, harmless in isolation, took on greater significance in context. The question that loomed over investigators now became unavoidable. Did Jason leave the hotel during the night and return without triggering any keycard entry? If he had used the hotel's side exit, one not electronically monitored, it was possible. It would have allowed him to leave undetected and return hours later, bypassing the front desk entirely. In parallel, investigators pulled GPS data and cell tower pings from Jason's phone. While he had turned it off for most of the night, a decision already raising eyebrows. It had briefly connected to a tower not far from a remote area between Raleigh and the Virginia Hotel around 4 a.m. Not definitive, but not nothing. Jason's gas consumption also became an unexpected red flag. Based on mileage calculations, the fuel he used during the trip exceeded what would have been necessary for a direct route. An investigator ran a model simulating a round trip to Raleigh under the cover of darkness. The numbers aligned. The more the team analyzed Jason's timeline, the more gaps emerged. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to shake confidence in the simplicity of his story. Then came a quiet but impactful breakthrough. A forensic specialist, assigned to swab the interior of Jason's vehicle, recovered faint traces of biological material embedded deep in the carpet fibers near the driver's seat. Preliminary analysis returned a partial DNA match to Michelle. Though degraded, the material was consistent with blood. It wasn't visible. It hadn't been cleaned thoroughly enough. It had simply settled beyond the surface, hidden from the eye but not from science. As this finding circulated among the investigative team, a grim consensus began to form. If Jason had driven from the hotel to the family home, committed the murder, and returned before sunrise, it would have required planning, timing, and emotional detachment, a level of premeditation that was disturbing to consider. But the emerging evidence, circumstantial though it remained, seemed to lead in that direction. The psychology of the situation was difficult to ignore. Those closest to Michelle described her recent emotional state with increasing clarity. She had become more withdrawn, more focused on her future without Jason. Friends recalled conversations about seeking legal advice. Family members remembered her saying things like, "I just want to feel safe again." In hindsight, these words became harrowing. Yet investigators had to be careful. In criminal cases, emotion cannot stand in place of evidence. And while Michelle's fear and Jason's inconsistencies painted a troubling portrait, a courtroom demanded more. The puzzle had to be completed, not just hinted at. So they kept digging. An old security camera from a nearby gas station, poor quality, black and white, timestamp partially corrupted, offered another lead. A blurry image of a vehicle, matching the make and model of Jason's, appeared at the pump at a time that contradicted his itinerary. It wasn't definitive, but it was another weight added to the scale. The case was turning into a mosaic. None of the pieces alone were conclusive, but together they began to form the outline of something undeniable. As investigators prepared for the possibility of seeking an arrest warrant, they faced one final challenge: the weight of responsibility. In cases like these where a spouse is the focus, the emotional stakes stretch far beyond the courtroom. Cassidy, barely more than a toddler, had already lost her mother. The idea of losing her father, too, to a cold cell and a life defined by headlines and court transcripts, was a tragedy within a tragedy. But justice does not consider convenience. And as the facts continued to align, justice became less a possibility and more a destination. In the world of criminal investigation, physical evidence may answer the question of how, but motive answers the haunting why. While many homicides stem from impulsive acts, committed in moments of fury or desperation, the case surrounding Michelle Young's death appeared far more controlled, calculated even. The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized that this was not just about a murder, it was about a motive carefully nurtured beneath the surface of a crumbling marriage. Michelle's friends and family were the first to speak of the growing distance in her relationship. What began as a romance between two ambitious young professionals had evolved into something colder, more transactional. Jason had once been charming, attentive, a partner who made Michelle feel chosen. Over time, however, that image had started to erode, slowly and painfully, under the weight of neglect, infidelity, and growing tension over the direction of their lives. Michelle had become a mother, and then an expectant mother again. She embraced the role with grace, but it demanded more from Jason than he seemed willing or perhaps able to give. While she worked a full-time job and managed their home life, Jason's work increasingly took him away, both physically and emotionally. His trips grew longer, his calls home less frequent. Eventually, his emotional absence transformed into suspicion. There were rumors, whispers of other women, nights away that couldn't be accounted for, vague excuses, and stories that didn't add up. One friend recounted Michelle's quiet confession at a lunch just weeks before her death. "I think something is going on. I don't feel safe in this relationship anymore." She hadn't elaborated, but her tone had shifted. This wasn't merely frustration, it was fear. Investigators gathered records, emails, financial transactions, travel itineraries, and began to map out Jason's behaviors. A concerning pattern emerged. He had been communicating with multiple women. Some of these interactions were emotional in nature, others hinted at something more. One woman had exchanged suggestive emails with him just days before Michelle's murder. Another was traced to a conference he had attended, during which Michelle had stayed home, heavily pregnant and exhausted, unaware of what her husband was doing. But Jason's infidelities were not the sole foundation for motive. They were symptoms of a larger dynamic, one that painted a more troubling picture when combined with Michelle's growing desire for independence. Documents retrieved from Michelle's computer revealed that she had been exploring her legal rights. Divorce, custody, asset division, these weren't passing thoughts but organized research. She had been preparing for the possibility that she might have to raise two children on her own. She had even begun to track Jason's income and spending, quietly gathering the information she would need to secure her future and protect her daughter. What was perhaps most significant wasn't just Michelle's research, but the fact that Jason might have known. One of the emails she drafted but never sent had been left open in her laptop's temporary files. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk about what comes next." Whether Jason saw it by accident or accessed it deliberately remains unknown, but its existence marked a turning point in the timeline. It was created just days before her murder. Financial stress may have added another layer to the motive. While the Youngs lived in a comfortable home and maintained a middle-class lifestyle, their finances weren't as stable as they appeared. Michelle's income was steady, and she managed most of the household expenses. Jason's business dealings were less predictable. Credit card records showed mounting debt. There were cash withdrawals without clear explanations. A divorce would not only cost Jason his family, it would cost him financial control. The more investigators pieced together this web of emotional detachment, infidelity, looming separation, and financial instability, the more compelling the narrative became. If Michelle had left Jason, he stood to lose much more than a partner. He would lose access to his daughter, his unborn child, and the domestic image he had presented to the outside world. And in that potential loss, investigators saw motive, one that was deeply personal, complex, and possibly premeditated. As they built a psychological profile, they considered something far more chilling. What if the murder wasn't an act of sudden passion, but a response to the slow, systematic unraveling of power? What if it was not about hatred or rage, but about control, about the fear of losing dominance, identity, or legacy? This was no longer a matter of whether Jason could have committed the crime. It was about whether the motive was strong enough to push him past the point of no return. Crime rarely announces itself with clarity. The scenes left behind by violence often resemble puzzles scattered across emotional terrain. Some pieces obvious, others buried under the noise of everyday life. In Michelle Young's case, the silence spoke loudest. It was in the undisturbed furniture, the unbroken windows, the absence of chaos that investigators first began to hear the quiet murmurings of truth. In this silence, they began to collect the smallest details, subtle clues that, when examined carefully, began to betray a carefully disguised story. The physical violence Michelle endured had been unmistakably brutal, but the scene surrounding her was sterile, almost eerily untouched. This juxtaposition unnerved seasoned professionals. If this had been a random act, a burglary gone wrong, or a crime of opportunity, there would be signs of intrusion, struggle, panic. Yet nothing in the rest of the house indicated frenzy. Instead, it looked as though the killer had moved with purpose, knowledge, and familiarity. A second pass through the crime scene allowed for a deeper forensic sweep. Forensic technicians revisited the floorboards, textiles, door handles, places not immediately dramatic, but often rich in trace evidence. It was during these re-examinations that a breakthrough emerged. Using luminol, a chemical that reacts with the iron in hemoglobin to reveal latent blood traces, investigators discovered the faint outline of what appeared to be a wiped-down trail near the foot of the bed, consistent with the movement of a body being dragged. The luminol illuminated more than footsteps. It illuminated intent. Whoever had killed Michelle hadn't fled in panic. They had stayed long enough to adjust the scene. This suggested composure, control, and time, all of which were incompatible with a spontaneous or opportunistic crime. In the master bathroom, a faint residue of blood was found around the base of the sink faucet, barely visible without chemical enhancement. This trace hinted that someone had attempted to clean themselves before leaving. Further analysis revealed a partial DNA profile, consistent with a male subject, though degraded. It wasn't enough for a definitive match yet, but it added pressure to a suspect already under mounting scrutiny. Meanwhile, Michelle's laptop became a source of digital evidence, subtle but telling. The hard drive had been partially scrubbed, but forensic analysts were able to recover fragments of deleted documents and cached files. Among them was a spreadsheet, likely prepared by Michelle, listing household expenses, Jason's travel schedules, and a private note in a comment cell. Separate account by next month? It was more than planning. It was a prelude to separation. Cassidy, the young's 2-year-old daughter, had unknowingly become part of the forensic trail. Her tiny footprints had been found in her mother's blood. An emotionally devastating image, but also a timeline indicator. Pediatric specialists and child psychologists worked alongside law enforcement to understand her behavior. She had been in the home for several hours after the murder occurred. Her wandering in and out of the room, her stillness when responders arrived, it all pointed to a child left unattended overnight. That meant the killer had left long before morning. What added complexity to the forensic picture was not just what was present, but what was missing. Jason's missing sneakers, a model he was known to wear regularly, became a central point of interest. A bloody footprint in the master bedroom, partial and lacking tread, was consistent in size and shape with the style of shoe. Jason had claimed he'd left them at home during his trip, yet they were never located during the initial search. Follow-up visits to his property yielded nothing. It was as if they had vanished entirely. In the trunk of Jason's car, investigators discovered fibers embedded deep within the carpet lining. Initially insignificant, these fibers were later found to be consistent with the fabric of the bedroom rug in the young home. While not a smoking gun, it was an important step in connecting the vehicle with the crime scene in a tangible, physical way. Even more subtle were the behavioral cues picked up through interviews with those who had interacted with Jason in the days immediately following Michelle's death. A hotel employee described him as oddly composed, someone who asked about the news with curiosity rather than grief. A neighbor recalled seeing him days later, appearing more annoyed by the presence of police than distraught. To many, these may have seemed like quirks, but in the context of violent loss, they stood out. Every experienced investigator knows that guilt, when present, leaves residue, not always in fingerprints or blood, but in behavior, tone, and what's not said. Jason's refusal to participate in a polygraph wasn't proof, but it wasn't meaningless either. His hesitations, his partial cooperation, the inconsistencies in his story, they were forming a pattern. Meanwhile, the forensic pathologist's report painted a grim picture. Michelle had suffered multiple blows to the head, consistent with a heavy, blunt object. There were no defensive wounds, no signs she had fought back, suggesting she had either been asleep, caught completely off guard, or attacked by someone she did not immediately perceive as a threat. That final point resonated deeply with the team. The lack of struggle, the absence of fear prior to the attack, all implied that Michelle had been in the presence of someone she trusted, someone whose presence in her bedroom at that hour did not alarm her. This wasn't just about collecting evidence anymore. It was about carefully listening to what the evidence was whispering. Each trace, each absence, each inconsistency was slowly telling the story. A story where silence was no longer empty. It was full of revelation. The decision to bring charges in a homicide case is never made lightly. When the suspect is a stranger, a name with no emotional tether to the victim, the path is clear. But when the man in question is a father, a husband, a person who once shared the victim's bed, the courtroom becomes not just a place of law, but of legacy, grief, and unrelenting scrutiny. By the time the investigative team brought their evidence before the Wake County District Attorney's Office, the case file had grown thick with reports, photographs, lab analyses, and timelines that fit together too precisely to be coincidence. The motive, the opportunity, the inconsistent alibi, all had been mapped and cross-referenced. Yet there remained no direct eyewitness, no confession, and the murder weapon had never been recovered. What they had was a case built on context, on absence, on forensic inference, a mosaic, not a photograph. Still, the DA's office moved forward. The warrant for Jason Young's arrest was signed just days before the third anniversary of Michelle's death. The timing was not symbolic, it was procedural. But to Michelle's family, it felt poetic in a cruel, overdue way. 3 years of silence. 3 years of raising Cassidy without answers. 3 years of birthdays, holidays, and court hearings where nothing had changed. Until now. When the news broke that Jason had been arrested and charged with first-degree murder, the media response was swift and divided. To many, he had always been the obvious suspect. Too calm, too controlled, too rehearsed. But others questioned whether prosecutors had enough to secure a conviction. This wasn't a case of fingerprints or bloody weapons. It was one of suggestion, pattern, and implication. The public divided along familiar lines, the believers and the skeptics. Some called it justice, others called it a witch hunt. Michelle's family, while privately devastated, released a brief statement. They spoke of Michelle's light, her unwavering love for her daughter, and their confidence in the legal system. What they didn't say, but what everyone knew, was that this arrest, no matter how long awaited, would never bring Michelle back. It would never answer the question that haunted them every morning. What was she thinking in those final moments? As the trial date approached, both prosecution and defense prepared their arsenals. The prosecution's strategy focused on motive and circumstantial consistency. They would show a man who had everything to lose, a disintegrating marriage, financial strain, the threat of divorce and custody battles. They would walk jurors through a timeline that accounted for Jason's suspicious movements, the inconsistencies in his hotel alibi, and the incriminating forensic evidence, partial DNA traces, a matching shoe print, and the digital traces Michelle had left behind. No single detail proved guilt, but together they built a narrative too structured to ignore. The defense, in contrast, leaned heavily on reasonable doubt. They pointed out the lack of direct evidence. No murder weapon, no eyewitness, no unbroken chain linking Jason to the exact moment of death. They emphasized the time gap, the reliance on forensic theory, and suggested the investigation had suffered from tunnel vision. Their strategy was simple: sow doubt, not certainty. The trial opened under intense media glare. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but that didn't stop speculation from flooding newsrooms and social media feeds. For days, the community watched closely as forensic analysts explained the luminol-enhanced drag marks, as hotel staff testified about Jason's odd behavior, and as Michelle's family took the stand to speak about her fear in the weeks before her death. A particularly emotional moment came when the crime scene photos were shown. Michelle's body partially covered on the floor, Cassidy's footprints in her blood. The courtroom fell into a silence so thick it pressed against the walls. Jason sat motionless throughout most of the trial. Occasionally he whispered to his attorney, but never addressed the jury. He did not take the stand in his own defense. When the prosecution rested, they believed they had laid out a compelling picture of premeditated murder. The defense countered with character witnesses expert testimony challenging the validity of some forensic interpretations, and a portrayal of Jason as a man overwhelmed, not homicidal. The closing arguments were passionate on both sides. The jury retired for deliberation with 12 voices, 12 perspectives, and a mountain of evidence that told more of a story than most cases ever do. Yet after 3 days, they returned without consensus. Some jurors were convinced beyond doubt. Others were unconvinced that theory could replace direct evidence. The result: a hung jury, a mistrial, no verdict. Michelle's family was devastated. The justice they had waited nearly 4 years to see was delayed yet again. Jason walked out of court a free man, for now shielded by the principle of reasonable doubt, but forever shadowed by suspicion. For the prosecution, the result was frustrating but not unexpected. Complex cases rarely conclude cleanly. They would regroup, analyze the trial's weaknesses, and prepare for the possibility of a retrial. For Michelle's family, it was another chapter of grief they hadn't asked for. Another holiday without her, another bedtime story for Cassidy told by someone trying to answer questions no child should ever have to ask. But even in the heartbreak of delay, there was momentum. A foundation had been laid, evidence had been presented, and while justice had not yet prevailed, it had not been denied. Justice in murder cases does not always come swiftly. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it never comes at all. And sometimes, after a long road of grief, legal uncertainty, and relentless pursuit, it arrives not as triumph, but as quiet closure. Months passed after the mistrial. Though Jason Young had walked free, his freedom was provisional. The prosecution, though bruised, had not backed down. They believed in their case. More importantly, Michelle's family believed in it too. The district attorney's office regrouped, analyzed the missteps of the first trial, and began preparing for a second, a trial they hoped would leave no room for ambiguity. In the meantime, Jason returned to a semblance of normal life, though that word no longer applied in any real sense. He was a man under constant scrutiny. Public opinion was deeply divided. He was no longer Jason the husband or Jason the father. He was Jason Young, accused of killing his pregnant wife. And in the eyes of many, that alone rendered him guilty, regardless of the courtroom outcome. The second trial began with a tone more focused, more measured. The prosecution came prepared to address the weaknesses exposed in the first proceedings. This time their argument was sharpened, not by vengeance, but by necessity. They leaned heavily into the forensic record, using clearer, more accessible language to explain the blood evidence, the drag marks, the timeline that aligned too perfectly with Jason's unexplained hours away from his hotel room. As the trial date approached, both prosecution and defense prepared their arsenals. The prosecution's strategy focused on motive and circumstantial consistency. They would show a man who had everything to lose: a disintegrating marriage, financial strain, the threat of divorce and custody battles. They would walk jurors through a timeline that accounted for Jason's suspicious movements, the inconsistencies in his hotel alibi, and the incriminating forensic evidence: partial DNA traces, a matching shoe print, and the digital traces Michelle had left behind. No single detail proved guilt, but together they built a narrative too structured to ignore. The defense, in contrast, leaned heavily on reasonable doubt. They pointed out the lack of direct evidence: no murder weapon, no eyewitness, no unbroken chain linking Jason to the exact moment of death. They emphasized the time gap, the reliance on forensic theory, and suggested the investigation had suffered from tunnel vision. Their strategy was simple: sow doubt, not certainty. The trial opened under intense media glare. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but that didn't stop speculation from flooding newsrooms and social media feeds. For days, the community watched closely as forensic analysts explained the luminol-enhanced drag marks, as hotel staff testified about Jason's odd behavior, and as Michelle's family took the stand to speak about her fear in the weeks before her death. A particularly emotional moment came when the crime scene photos were shown: Michelle's body partially covered on the floor, Cassidy's footprints in her blood. The courtroom fell into a silence so thick it pressed against the walls. Jason sat motionless throughout most of the trial. Occasionally he whispered to his attorney, but never addressed the jury. He did not take the stand in his own defense. When the prosecution rested, They believed they had laid out a compelling picture of premeditated murder. The defense countered with character witnesses, expert testimony challenging the validity of some forensic interpretations, and a portrayal of Jason as a man overwhelmed, not homicidal. The closing arguments were passionate on both sides. The jury retired for deliberation with 12 voices, 12 perspectives, and a mountain of evidence that told more of a story than most cases ever do. Yet after 3 days, they returned without consensus. Some jurors were convinced beyond doubt. Others were unconvinced that theory could replace direct evidence. The result: a hung jury, a mistrial, no verdict. Michelle's family was devastated. The justice they had waited nearly 4 years to see was delayed yet again. Jason walked out of court a free man, for now shielded by the principle of reasonable doubt, but forever shadowed by suspicion. For the prosecution, the result was frustrating but not unexpected. Complex cases rarely conclude cleanly. They would regroup, analyze the trial's weaknesses, and prepare for the possibility of a retrial. For Michelle's family, it was another chapter of grief they hadn't asked for. Another holiday without her, another bedtime story for Cassidy told by someone trying to answer questions no child should ever have to ask. But even in the heartbreak of delay, there was momentum. A foundation had been laid, evidence had been presented, and while justice had not yet prevailed, it had not been denied. Justice in murder cases does not always come swiftly. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it never comes at all, and sometimes after a long road of grief, legal uncertainty, and relentless pursuit, it arrives not as triumph, but as quiet closure. Months passed after the mistrial. Though Jason Young had walked free, his freedom was provisional. The prosecution, though bruised, had not backed down. They believed in their case. More importantly, Michelle's family believed in it too. The district attorney's office regrouped, analyzed the missteps of the first trial, and began preparing for a second, a trial they hoped would leave no room for ambiguity. In the meantime, Jason returned to a semblance of normal life, though that word no longer applied in any real sense. He was a man under constant scrutiny. Public opinion was deeply divided. He was no longer Jason the husband or Jason the father. He was Jason Young, accused of killing his pregnant wife. And in the eyes of many, that alone rendered him guilty, regardless of the courtroom outcome. The second trial began with a tone more focused, more measured. The prosecution came prepared to address the weaknesses exposed in the first proceedings. This time their argument was sharpened, not by vengeance, but by necessity. They leaned heavily into the forensic record, using clearer, more accessible language to explain the blood evidence, the drag marks, the timeline that aligned too perfectly with Jason's unexplained hours away from his hotel room.